He refused her hand, and by sunset, the land itself came to ask why. The riders were already there before he understood what he had done. 300 silhouettes lining the edge of his property like shadows cast by a setting sun, unmoving, silent, watching. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his ranch house, one hand resting against the rough wood post worn smooth by years of habit, his breath shallow despite the still air, the kind of silence that didn't belong to nature pressing in around him, heavy as a held breath. No one reached for a weapon. No one shouted. The horses shifted once in a while, leather creaking soft, hooves pressing into the dust, but the men on their backs remained as still as carved stone. Ethan had seen riders before, traders, drifters, cattle hands, but never like this. Not like a single will stretched across 300 men. Not like judgment without a voice. His throat tightened as his eyes searched the line, counting without meaning to 10, 20, 50, until the number stopped mattering and the weight of them settled somewhere deep in his chest. It didn't make sense. He hadn't stolen anything, hadn't fired a shot, hadn't crossed into their land. The ranch stretched quiet behind him, fences straight, cattle grazing slow in the fading light. Everything exactly as it had been that morning. That morning, the memory came back not as a storm, but as a single, sharp image. A hand, small, steady, offered without hesitation. He saw it again as if it were still there in front of him, dust catching in the sunlight, the town behind them holding its breath. She hadn't looked afraid. That was the first thing that had unsettled him. Most people lowered their eyes around men like Ethan Cole, men who owned land, who spoke and expected to be heard, but she hadn't. Her gaze had been level, quiet, carrying something he couldn't name. Respect, maybe, or something older than that. Something that didn't need permission. He had felt it then, that small flicker of discomfort, the way a man feels when a mirror shows more than he expects. And instead of stepping forward, instead of meeting her halfway, he had turned. Not quickly, not angrily, just enough to let the space between them harden. The laughter had come a second later, low at first, then spreading through the men behind him like dry grass catching a spark. Someone had said something about knowing your place. Someone else had chuckled. Ethan hadn't joined in, but he hadn't stopped it either. He had simply walked past her, boots heavy on the wooden boards, leaving her hand suspended in the air for a moment too long. That was all. Just a moment. Just a hand refused. A small thing, he had told himself. Nothing worth remembering. But now, standing there with 300 riders watching his every breath, it felt like the only thing that mattered. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of leather and dust, and something else, sage, maybe, or smoke from a fire burned far away. One of the riders near the front moved then, just slightly, enough for Ethan to notice the figure stepping forward from the line. She walked without hurry, boots barely stirring the ground, her presence cutting through the silence not by force, but by certainty. Ayanna Takota. He didn't know her name yet, not truly, but he knew her face the moment he saw it again. The same calm eyes, the same steady way of standing. Around her neck, something caught the last light of the sun, a small silver circle, simple, worn, glinting just once before settling back against her chest. She stopped a few yards from the edge of his porch, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore. And still, no one else moved. Ethan felt the weight of every rider behind her, not pressing forward, not demanding anything, just present, waiting. The kind of waiting that doesn't ask for time, but for truth. He opened his mouth, not sure what he meant to say, but the words didn't come. Because somewhere between that morning and this moment, something had shifted. Not in them, in him. And for the first time since he had built this ranch, since he had carved his name into the land with work and will and distance, Ethan Cole realized that a man could stand on everything he owned and still have nowhere to stand at all. The silence did not break when she stepped closer. It only shifted, like wind changing direction across an open plain, and Ethan could feel it settle against his skin in a way that made the evening air feel colder than it should have been for late summer. The sun still hanging low but warm on the horizon, casting long shadows from the fence posts that stretched like lines drawn across the land. He thought he understood. Ayanna did not look back at the riders behind her, did not need to, because whatever bound them together was not spoken or signaled, it simply was, and that unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. He had built his life on things he could measure: acres of land, head of cattle, the weight of a handshake that meant a man's word was solid. And yet the one thing he had refused that morning now stood in front of him, quiet and unmoving, carrying more weight than all of it. His fingers tightened slightly against the porch post, the wood pressing into his palm as if to remind him that this place was still his, that nothing had been taken, nothing had been threatened, and still it felt like something had already been lost. He cleared his throat, the sound small against the wide open space, and finally found his voice, though it came out lower than he intended, rough from disuse in the face of something he could not command. "I do not understand what this is," he said, each word measured, careful, as if speaking too quickly might tip something unseen. Ayanna tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, as if she had expected those exact words, as if this moment had already played out somewhere beyond his understanding. The silver circle at her neck caught the light again, and this time Ethan noticed the details, the worn edges, the faint markings etched into its surface, not decorative but deliberate, like something made for a purpose rather than display. Behind her, one of the horses exhaled softly, a slow breath that carried across the distance. And for a moment Ethan became aware of every small sound: the creak of leather, the distant call of a bird settling for the night, the dry whisper of wind brushing through the grass, all of it continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. "You understood enough this morning," Ayanna said, her voice steady, not raised, not accusing, just present, the kind of voice that did not need to push to be heard. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest at that, not anger, not yet, but something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has been seen more clearly than he intended. "That was nothing," he replied, a little too quickly, and he heard it himself, the thin edge in his own voice that did not belong there. "Just a moment in town. Nothing more." Ayanna took one more step forward, closing the distance by a few feet, still leaving space, still respecting a boundary he had not earned but that she honored anyway, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. "A moment is enough," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his, because a moment shows what a man chooses when no one forces him. The words settled between them, not heavy, not loud, but impossible to move around, and Ethan found himself looking past her for just a second, his gaze drifting to the riders, to the long line of figures who had come without demand, without threat, simply to stand and witness whatever this was becoming. He remembered then something old Jacob Harlan had muttered back in town, a man who had seen more years than most and spoke less because of it. Something about a circle, about an offering that meant more than trade, more than words, something that was not given lightly and never given twice. Ethan had not listened. He had not needed to, or at least that was what he had believed. The porch beneath his boots felt suddenly smaller, the land beyond it stretching wide, but offering no comfort. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole felt the weight of being exactly where he stood, with nowhere to step that did not carry consequence. He looked back at her then, really looked this time, at the steadiness in her posture, the absence of anger in her expression, and the quiet certainty that had brought 300 riders to the edge of his world without a single word spoken, and he realized that whatever this was, it had never been about force, never about taking anything from him. It had always been about something he had already given away without even knowing it. The weight of her words did not fade when the wind shifted again. It only settled deeper, like dust finding its way into every crack, no matter how tightly a man tried to close himself off. And Ethan could feel it now in places he had not expected, not in his hands or his voice, but somewhere behind his ribs where certainty used to sit. He drew in a slow breath, the scent of dry grass and leather filling his lungs, grounding him in the land he had worked for years to shape, and for a moment he held on to that, onto the fences he had mended with his own hands, the cattle he had raised through drought and winter, the long mornings and longer nights that had built everything standing behind him. This was his place. He had earned it. No one had given it to him. That thought rose quickly, almost defensively, and he let it steady him just enough to lift his chin and meet her gaze again. "You came all this way for a moment," he said, his tone firmer now, though still careful, as if testing ground that might not hold. 300 riders for something that meant nothing. Ayanna did not react the way he expected, did not challenge him or correct him. She only studied him for a heartbeat longer. And in that quiet observation, there was something that made his words feel smaller than they had sounded in his own head. Behind her, the riders remained exactly as they had been, not shifting, not pressing forward, their stillness carrying a kind of discipline Ethan recognized but did not understand, because it was not enforced, it was chosen. "You believe it meant nothing," she said, and the way she said it was not a question, it was an acknowledgement, like naming the shape of something already seen. Ethan let out a breath through his nose, a faint sound of impatience slipping through despite himself. "It was a handshake," he replied. "That is all. People do it every day, or they do not. Life goes on." He gestured slightly toward the land around him, the open stretch of pasture fading into shadow, the sky beginning to turn from gold to a deeper blue. Nothing here has changed because of it. For the first time since she had stepped forward, Ayana's gaze shifted, not away from him entirely, but outward, following the line of the land as if measuring something beyond fences and ownership. And when she looked back, there was a softness there, not pity, not judgment, something quieter. "Everything changed," she said. "Not here." She tapped her fingers lightly against her chest. Just once, the motion small but deliberate. "Here." The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight Ethan could not dismiss, because it pointed to something he had spent years ignoring, something that did not fit into ledgers or boundaries or agreements signed with ink and witnessed by men who thought the same way he did. He shifted his stance slightly, boots scraping against the porch wood, a small sound that felt louder than it should have in the stillness. "You are talking in circles," he said, though the edge in his voice had softened, replaced by something closer to unease. "If you have something to say, then say it plain." Ayana nodded once, as if that was fair, as if plain words were something he deserved even now. "That morning," she began, "I offered you peace." Ethan almost scoffed, the reaction rising before he could stop it, because the word did not match the memory he carried, did not match the dusty street or the low laughter or the way he had simply walked past her. "Peace," he repeated, quieter now, not mocking, but uncertain. It was a greeting. Ayana reached up slowly and touched the silver circle at her neck, her fingers resting against it as if drawing something from its presence. "It was more than that," she said. "This was carried across lands before your fences stood here. It was given when two sides chose not to see each other as less. When I held out my hand, I carried this with me." Ethan's eyes followed the movement, really seeing the object now, the way it sat not as decoration, but as something worn with purpose, something that had history pressed into its surface. "And you think refusing that?" he began, then stopped, because the rest of the sentence did not come as easily as he expected. Ayana finished it for him, her voice steady as ever. "It told me who you are when you are not forced to choose differently." The words did not accuse, they did not rise or fall with emotion. They simply existed, and that made them harder to push aside. Ethan felt his jaw tighten slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, the kind that comes when a man feels something shifting inside him and does not yet know how to hold it still. Around them, the light continued to fade, the horizon dimming as the last edge of the sun slipped lower, and the long line of riders remained, not demanding, not moving, just present, as if the land itself had paused to listen to something Ethan had never thought he would have to hear. The last light of the sun slipped lower, stretching the shadows of the riders until they reached the edge of Ethan's porch like long fingers that did not touch, but could not be ignored. And for the first time since they arrived, he became aware of how quiet his own land had grown, how even the cattle had drifted toward the far end of the pasture, as if sensing something beyond sight, something that did not belong to fences or ownership. Ethan shifted his weight again, slower this time, his boots pressing into the wood as if testing whether it would still hold him the way it always had. But the steadiness he expected did not come as easily, because the ground beneath a man is not always the boards he stands on. Sometimes it is the choices he made hours earlier without thinking twice. He let his gaze drift past Ayana for a moment, scanning the long line of riders once more, and what struck him now was not their number, but their patience, the way not a single one of them broke formation, not a single voice rose above the quiet, as if they had not come to take anything, only to be present for something that had already happened. That unsettled him more than any threat could have, Because a man can prepare for force, he can meet it, resist it, even understand it. But this was something else entirely. Why are they here, then? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge it carried before, because the question no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like something he needed answered whether he wanted to admit it or not. If what you offered was peace, and I turned away, then why bring them all the way out here just to stand and look at me? Ayanna followed his gaze briefly, her eyes moving across the riders not with pride or command, but with a quiet acknowledgement, as if each one of them carried their own reason for being there, something personal and unspoken. They came because I told them what happened, she said, her voice steady, and because what is refused in daylight should not be hidden by night. Ethan frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion that was beginning to take shape into something deeper, something harder to push aside. You told them I did not shake your hand, he said, the words sounding smaller the moment they left him. That is all it took. Ayanna looked back at him, and for the first time there was something like a faint sadness in her expression, not for herself, but for the space between what he believed and what had actually occurred. No, she said quietly, I told them that I offered respect, and you chose not to return it. The distinction landed heavier than he expected, because it shifted the moment from something simple into something that carried weight, something that reached beyond the dusty street and into a place he had never considered. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes dropping briefly to the ground between them, to the thin layer of dust that had settled over everything, the same dust that had been there that morning, unchanged, uncaring, and yet somehow now it felt different, as if it held the imprint of something he had missed when it mattered. You could have just walked away, he said after a moment, quieter now, not as a defense, but as an observation he was trying to hold on to. Most people would have. Ayanna nodded slightly. Most people do, she replied, and that is why nothing changes. The words did not accuse him, but they did not let him go either, and Ethan felt something tighten again in his chest, not sharp, not painful, but persistent, like a truth pressing gently until it could no longer be ignored. The sky above them deepened into a darker shade, the last line of sunlight thinning along the horizon, and still the riders did not move, their presence now less like a threat and more like a mirror, reflecting something back at him he had never been forced to see. He lifted his eyes again, meeting Ayanna's gaze, and for the first time there was no resistance in it, only a quiet question he did not yet know how to ask. What happens now? He said finally, the words carrying none of the certainty they would have held that morning. Ayanna studied him for a moment, as if measuring not the man he had been hours ago, but the one standing in front of her now, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less steady. Now, she said, you decide whether that moment was the truth of you, or just the part you have not learned to change. The wind moved again, gentle this time, carrying the faint sound of horses shifting and leather settling, and somewhere in the distance a bird called once before falling silent, leaving Ethan standing there between what he had done and what he might still choose to do, with 300 witnesses who would not speak for him, and would not need to. The question lingered in the air long after she spoke it, not demanding an answer, not pressing him forward, just existing in that quiet space between them where truth had nowhere left to hide, and Ethan found himself standing there longer than he ever had without speaking, without deciding, without reaching for the certainty that had always come so easily before. The porch beneath him felt the same, the wood worn and familiar, the edges shaped by years of use, but it no longer carried the same weight, because for the first time he understood that a man could stand on something solid and still not know where he stood. He looked out again across the riders, really looked this time, not counting them, not measuring them, but seeing them, the different shapes and ages, the quiet way they sat their horses, the way none of them leaned forward or back, as if they had all agreed without words to hold that exact distance, to leave the space between them and his land untouched. They had not crossed his fence, not one of them. That detail settled into him slowly, almost reluctantly, because it did not match the story he had been telling himself since they arrived. They were not here to take. They were not here to force anything. They were here to witness what he would do next. That realization carried more weight than any threat could have, because it left him with something he could not fight and could not avoid. He shifted his gaze back to Ayanna, and this time there was no attempt to defend himself, No quick explanation rising to meet her words. Only a quiet awareness of how little he had understood that morning, how easily he had dismissed something he had not even taken the time to see. "You said I decide," he murmured, more to himself than to her, the words slow as if he were testing each one before letting it go. Ayana did not nod, did not confirm it. She simply waited, the same way the riders waited, the same way the land itself seemed to be holding still around them, as if time had stretched just enough to give him space to choose without being pushed. Ethan drew in a long breath, letting it out slowly, feeling the tightness in his chest shift slightly, not gone, but no longer as sharp as before. His eyes dropped again, this time not to the dust, but to his own hands, rough and worn from years of work, hands that had built fences, carried water, fixed what broke and held what needed holding. Hands that had refused something simple without a second thought. He flexed his fingers once, the motion small, almost uncertain, as if testing whether they still belonged to him in the same way they had that morning. The memory returned again, clearer now, not just the image of her hand, but the way it had been offered, steady, without hesitation, without demand, and he realized that what unsettled him then was not her. It was the way she had stood without needing anything from him. That had been the moment he turned away from, not her hand, but what it represented. He lifted his gaze slowly, meeting hers again, and for the first time there was no barrier in it, no distance he was trying to maintain, only a quiet recognition of something he had not known how to face before. "What if it was," he said, his voice low, carrying none of the certainty it once had. "What if that moment was not all of me?" The words hung there, not as a defense, but as a possibility, something he was offering now instead of dismissing. Ayana studied him for a long second, and in that silence there was a shift so subtle it could have been missed, a softening that did not change her posture or her voice, but changed something in the space between them. "Then you would not leave it as it was," she said gently. The answer was simple, almost too simple, and that made it harder, because it did not give him a path to follow. It only pointed back to the choice itself. Ethan felt his heartbeat steady slightly, not faster, not slower, just more present, as if something inside him had settled enough to be heard. He glanced once more at the riders, at the long line of quiet witnesses who had come without force, and then back to her, to the place where everything had begun that morning. The air had cooled now, the last light nearly gone, and still no one moved. The land waited. She waited. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole understood that what he did next would not be measured by acres or cattle or the strength of his name, but by something far smaller and far more difficult to give. The stillness held, but something inside it began to shift, not in the riders, not in the land, but in the space between Ethan and the choice he had been circling since the sun first touched the horizon. And for a long moment he did nothing at all, just stood there with his hands at his sides, feeling the weight of them, the memory of what they had refused, and the quiet understanding of what they might still offer. He took one step forward, slow and deliberate, the wood of the porch giving a soft creak beneath his boot, a small sound that carried farther than he expected in the hush that surrounded them. And then he stopped again, not because something held him back, but because he had never done this without certainty before, never moved without knowing exactly where he stood. The difference now was not the distance between him and Ayana. It was the distance between who he had been that morning and who he might be if he chose differently. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and this time it did not feel tight in his chest. It felt open, uncertain, but real. The ground beyond the porch stretched out before him, the same dry earth he had crossed 1,000 times without thinking, but tonight it felt like something else. Entirely. Like a line he had to step across without knowing what waited on the other side. He stepped down. The dirt gave slightly beneath his boot, familiar and unchanged, and yet the act of leaving the porch carried more weight than anything he had done all day, because it was the first time he had moved without trying to hold on to what had already passed. Ayana did not move when he approached, did not step forward to meet him, did not close the space he was choosing to cross on his own, and that, more than anything, told him this was not about her proving anything, it was about him. He stopped a few feet away, close enough now to see the faint lines in the silver circle at her neck, the way it had been worn by time and touch, the way it held something that had existed long before he had ever set foot on this land. His hands hung at his sides for a moment longer, and then slowly, without force, without hesitation, he lifted one. The motion was simple, almost small, but it carried a weight that pressed through his chest and into the quiet around them, because it was not just a hand this time. It was a choice made without the protection of pride. He did not speak right away, because the words he might have used that morning no longer fit, and anything less than the truth would have fallen short in the presence of 300 silent witnesses who did not need to hear him to understand what he meant. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words low but steady, not loud enough to carry to the riders, but not meant for them anyway. "I saw something I did not understand, and I chose to turn away from it." The admission did not feel like losing something. It felt like setting something down that had been heavier than he knew. His hand remained extended, not demanding, not expecting, simply offered, the same way hers had been that morning, the same way he had refused without a second thought. The difference now was that he understood what it meant to leave it unanswered. Ayanna looked at his hand, then back at his face, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that space between them, the quiet stretching just enough to hold the weight of everything that had brought them here. Behind her, the riders did not move, but something in the air shifted, not louder, not visible, just a subtle easing, like tension loosening in a place no one had named. She reached up and touched the silver circle once more, her fingers brushing against it lightly, and then she lowered her hand, not to the ground, not to her side, but forward, meeting his halfway. Her hand was steady, just as it had been that morning, but this time when their hands met, there was no hesitation, no turning away, only contact, simple and real. The moment was quiet, smaller than everything that had led to it, and yet it carried more weight than all of it combined, because nothing else had been required to change what had been set in motion hours before. Ethan felt it then, not in his hand, but in the space inside him that had shifted from resistance to something else, something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself by turning away. He did not hold on longer than necessary, did not try to make the moment into something bigger than it was, because he understood now that its meaning did not come from how long it lasted, but from the fact that it happened at all. When their hands parted, the silence returned, but it was not the same silence that had come before. It was lighter, less heavy, as if something that had been waiting had finally been answered without needing to be spoken aloud. The moment their hands parted did not end anything. It revealed something, and the quiet that followed carried a different weight now, not heavy with judgment, but steady, like ground that had finally settled after a long shift beneath the surface. Ethan let his hand fall back to his side, slower this time, aware of the movement, aware of the space it had crossed, and what it had taken to do something so simple, and for a brief second he stood there without thinking about what came next, because for the first time since the riders appeared, there was no pressure to defend, no need to explain, only the presence of what had already been done. Ayanna watched him for a moment longer, and there was no longer that distance in her gaze. No quiet measure of who he might be, because something in that question had already been answered without needing to be spoken again. She turned then, not abruptly, not as a signal, but as a natural movement, like someone who had come to the end of a path and knew where the next step led. The silver circle at her neck caught the last trace of light as she shifted, and Ethan noticed how it no longer felt like something distant or unfamiliar, but something he had been allowed, in a small way, to understand. Behind her, the riders responded without a word, without a command, as if her movement had carried through them like a current through still water. One by one, then all at once, they adjusted in their saddles, the soft sound of leather and reins moving through the air, not loud, not sudden, just enough to mark a change. No one crossed the fence. No one moved closer. Instead, the line began to open, not breaking, but turning, each rider guiding their horse with quiet precision, the entire formation shifting as a single body without losing its shape. Ethan watched it happen, not with the tension he had felt before, but with a kind of still attention, the same way a man watches something he does not fully understand but knows carries meaning beyond him. The riders did not look at him as they turned, not out of disregard, but because they did not need to anymore. Whatever had brought them here had already reached its end. The sound of hooves began to carry across the land, soft at first, then building into a steady rhythm as the first rows moved away, their silhouettes blending into the deepening blue of the evening, the dust rising lightly beneath them, catching what little light remained before fading into the open stretch beyond the ranch. Ethan remained where he stood, not following, not calling out, because there was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been done. Ayanna paused for a brief moment before stepping away fully, her figure turning with the others, and for a heartbeat she looked back, not to check, not to question, but simply to acknowledge, a small, quiet recognition that did not need to last longer than it did. Then she turned forward again, and the distance between them began to grow, not sharply, not suddenly, but steadily, like the kind of distance that does not separate, only changes what two people carry with them. The riders continued to move, row after row, until the line that had once stretched across the edge of his land began to dissolve into the horizon, the sound of their passing fading with the light, leaving behind only the faint impression of where they had been. The land around Ethan returned to itself slowly, the quiet no longer pressing, the air no longer heavy, just the open space he had always known, but somehow different now, as if something invisible had been lifted without leaving a mark. He stood there for a long moment after the last rider disappeared from view, his eyes resting on the empty stretch where they had stood, and he realized that nothing on his ranch had changed, not the fences, not the cattle, not the ground beneath his feet, and yet something in him had shifted in a way that could not be measured or counted. He turned back toward the porch, the familiar boards waiting where he had left them, but he did not step onto them right away. Instead, he paused at the edge, looking down at his hands once more, not as tools, not as something to build or fix with, but as something that carried the weight of a choice he had almost missed. And in that quiet moment, with the last of the light gone and the night settling in without hurry, Ethan Cole understood something he had never needed to before, that a man is not remembered by what he owns or what he keeps, but by the moments when he chooses not to turn away. The night settled fully over the ranch, not with a sudden drop, but with a slow, steady dimming that turned the land into shapes and outlines, the fences stretching like quiet lines into the dark, the sky opening wide above him with the first stars beginning to show, and Ethan remained where he was, just off the porch, as if stepping back onto it would return him to something that no longer fit the same way it had before. The sound of the riders had faded completely now, leaving behind only the natural rhythm of the land, the distant rustle of grass, the soft movement of cattle, shifting in the pasture, and his own breath, steady but different, as if each inhale carried more than air, as if it carried the weight of what had passed, and what it meant to carry it forward. He finally stepped onto the porch, the wood giving that familiar creak beneath his boot, but it did not feel like returning. It felt like arriving somewhere new within the same place, and he paused there, his hand brushing lightly against the post, not to steady himself, but as if acknowledging it, the same way he had finally acknowledged something far simpler and far more important just moments before. His eyes moved across the land again, slower this time, not measuring, not claiming, just seeing, and in the distance, where the riders had disappeared, there was nothing left to mark their presence except a faint settling of dust that the night air was already beginning to smooth away. He let out a quiet breath and turned slightly, glancing toward the barn, toward the well, toward all the things that had defined his days for years, and for the first time he understood that none of them had been the hardest part of what it meant to live here. The hardest part had been something he had not even known he was avoiding, something that did not require strength or endurance, but something quieter, something that asked a man to see beyond himself without being forced to. He moved slowly along the porch, each step deliberate, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when a man realizes that even the smallest actions carry weight when they are chosen instead of assumed. When he reached the door, he stopped again, his hand hovering near the handle, and for a moment he looked back once more, not expecting to see anything, not hoping for anything to return, but simply to mark the place where everything had shifted without leaving a single mark on the ground. The open land stretched out in front of him, quiet and unchanged, and yet it no longer felt empty in the same way. It felt like something that held more than it showed, something that carried the memory of what had happened not in its surface, but in the way it would be seen from this moment forward. Ethan lowered his hand from the door without opening it, the need to go inside no longer pressing. and instead he leaned lightly against the frame, his gaze lifting toward the sky, where the stars had begun to fill the darkness, steady and distant, each one holding its place without needing to be noticed. He thought about the morning, about how easily he had walked through it without seeing what had been offered to him, how quickly he had turned away from something that did not fit the shape of what he expected, and he realized that it had not been the first time he had done that, only the first time he had been made to stand still long enough to recognize it. The wind moved again, cooler now, brushing against his face and carrying the faint scent of the open plains, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in weariness, but in acknowledgement, the kind that does not need words to be understood. When he opened them again, nothing had changed, and that was exactly what made it different, because he no longer expected change to come from the land or from others. He understood now that it came from the moment a man chose not to turn away from what he did not yet understand. He remained there for a long while, not counting the time, not measuring the distance between what had been and what would come next, just standing in the quiet that no longer pressed against him, but held him in a way that felt steady and true, as if the land itself had not changed at all, only the way he stood upon it had. Morning came without ceremony, the same way it always did over Ethan Cole's ranch, the sky lightening slowly from deep blue to pale gold, the air still cool enough to carry the quiet before the day began, and for a long moment nothing seemed different at all. The fences stood where they had always stood, the cattle moved lazily across the pasture, and the land stretched wide and familiar in every direction. But Ethan did not step onto the porch the same way he had every morning before, not with the same rhythm, not with the same certainty that the day would unfold exactly as expected. He paused at the doorway first, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes moving across the land, not to measure it, but to take it in, as if seeing it for the first time without trying to own it in that same quiet, unquestioned way. The memory of the night before did not come back as a storm. It did not rush in or demand his attention. It settled instead, steady and present, like something that had found its place and would remain there without needing to be forced. He stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath his boots, and this time the sound did not feel like routine. It felt like a reminder, something simple that marked where he stood and how he chose to stand there. His gaze drifted toward the far edge of the land where the riders had once lined the horizon, but there was nothing there now, no dust, no movement, only the open stretch of earth that belonged to no man more than any other, and yet he did not feel the need to claim it the way he once had. Instead, he leaned slightly against the post, the same one he had gripped the night before, and let his hands rest there, open and still, not holding, not resisting, just present. A faint sound carried on the morning air then, distant but clear enough to catch his attention, the slow rhythm of hooves. Not many, not hurried, just a single rider approaching from beyond the far rise. Ethan did not tense, did not reach for anything. He simply watched, the way a man watches something he does not yet understand but no longer fears. The figure grew clearer as it drew closer, the outline familiar even before the details came into view, the steady posture, the quiet way the horse moved beneath her, and when she reached the edge of his fence, she stopped, not crossing, not calling out, just waiting in that same quiet way that had defined everything she had done. Ayanna Takota sat there for a moment, the morning light catching the silver circle at her neck, and then she dismounted slowly, her boots touching the ground with a soft, measured step. She did not approach the porch, did not close the distance. She simply stood there, on her side of the fence, as if honoring something that had been understood without needing to be spoken. Ethan stepped down from the porch, without hesitation this time, the movement natural, unforced, and he walked across the yard until he stood a few feet from the fence, the same space between them, but no longer carrying the same weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence that settled there was not heavy. It was calm, like something that had already found its balance. Then Ayanna reached into the small pouch at her side and drew out the silver circle, lifting it gently from around her neck, the cord sliding free with a soft motion that seemed almost ceremonial in its simplicity. She held it for a second, her fingers resting against its worn surface, and then she stepped forward just enough to place it carefully on the top rail of the fence between them. It did not shine brightly in the morning light. It did not demand attention, It simply rested there, quiet and unassuming, like the gesture itself. Ethan looked at it, then at her, the meaning not fully spoken, but clear enough in the space between them. "This is not a gift," she said softly, her voice carrying easily in the still air. "It is a reminder." Ethan nodded slowly, not because he fully understood everything it represented, but because he understood enough now to know that he did not need to. He reached out, not quickly, not with the same certainty he once carried, but with intention, and he took the silver circle into his hand, feeling its weight, light but present, something that had traveled further than he had ever needed to, and yet had found its way here all the same. When he looked up again, Ayana was already stepping back, her hand resting briefly on the saddle before she mounted again, her movements as steady and quiet as before. She did not wait for thanks, did not ask for anything in return. She simply gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just enough to mark the moment, and then she turned her horse, guiding it back toward the open land without looking back again. Ethan remained by the fence, the silver circle resting in his palm, watching as her figure grew smaller against the wide stretch of morning light until she disappeared beyond the rise, leaving behind nothing but the quiet of the land and the weight of something he now carried. He stood there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just holding that small piece of worn silver, and in the stillness of that moment, he understood something that no rider, no number, no force could have taught him, that out here, far beyond the reach of towns and names and fences, a man is not judged by the land he stands on, but by the hand he chooses not to refuse when it is offered. And sometimes, the only justice that matters is the kind that leaves a man alone with the truth he can no longer ignore.